This week on Talking Politics USA, how Donald Trump is upsetting old alliances.
20,000 troops from some random country.
The damage was frankly done the minute he said it.
Do they quite like the fact that he's giving Canada a bashing? We assess the first 50 days of the Trump presidency.
Behind this veneer of, full steam ahead unity, there are divisions.
Democrats still do not know what to make of Donald Trump.
And we answer your questions.
Do I ever see him rolling tanks and planes into, London or Paris? No.
Hello and welcome to Talking Politics USA. It has been another head-spinning week. Quite soon we will just accept that is the norm. I'm joined, as ever, by Dan, our Washington correspondent. Dan, I have to say, I do feel for you. There is just never a pause. It's like relentless news, is it not?
It's been a long week last week, yeah, and another one this week. I think it feels like every day is a month in politics.
We should be grateful. Everyone keeps saying it's great for the news business, and I'm like, yeah, but I'm also joined by long-term Republican strategist Matt Bartlett. Matt, similarly for you, I guess it's hard to keep up with the pace of things.
Always busy and crazy here in Sin City, Washington, D.C., yes.
I wanted to get into talking about the latest Trump insults the last 24 hours on Poland, another key ally, and one that actually does, as Trump has repeatedly demanded of other NATO allies, a country that does spend nearly 5% of its GDP on defence. So we'll get into that. But first, every single place I have been in the UK over the past couple of days, most people have wanted to talk about one thing above all, which is this clip of JD Vance. I'm just going to, let's just play it and then we'll talk about it.
If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
Now, the difficulty JD Vance has come up with in that clip is that the only countries who've offered troops so far definitively are the likes of Britain and France, who have, of course, fought wars over the last 20 years, America's wars, most people would call them, and many people have bled and died in them. Now, the interesting thing I've found over the last 48 hours or more is that the people most offended, and grievously offended would be the understatement of the year, are those who would be traditionally most pro-Americans, kind of servicemen, people of a kind of conservative background. It's just impossible to exaggerate how offended many of them clearly are. Matthew, can I maybe start with you? What is your, we've had a bit of time for this to all percolate now, haven't we? And we've, seen in Canada, Mark Carney's been elected. He's already taken a very robust approach, saying, don't underestimate us, don't insult us, we're your closest ally. We've now seen the polls beginning to bite back and getting into a spat with Elon Musk and Marco Rubio. What do you make of it all?
This is Donald Trump has been on the political scene for about a decade now. And now on his, second return to power, we are seeing this massive realignment in American politics, what is right, what is left, and now obviously the geopolitical world order, alliances, allies, adversaries, new challenges, Cold War relics like Vladimir Putin, which are still a valid threat, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe, but the rise of China on the horizon, this asymmetric economic competition, and you're also seeing, a pronounced, American hesitancy to engage militarily around the world. This is all possible, what Donald Trump is doing, because of America's, one would say, overextension around the world for the past quarter century in oftentimes misguided places with very unclear, undefined objectives.
Dan, I think European leaders and many people in Europe are still struggling to make sense of this. And, I guess there are two broad interpretations. One, Donald Trump doesn't care that much about Europe and NATO, but he's still fundamentally committed to his old alliances. He just wants them to do more. And then on the other side of the equation, he thinks the war in Ukraine is ridiculous. Nobody's winning, needs to be wound up. And the most important thing from his point of view is to bring Russia to the table, because he hasn't really got any leverage over Russia, but he's got a lot of leverage over Ukraine. That's the most benign interpretation, that actually he's playing a sort of bit of a long game that might bring peace to Ukraine and might, broadly get Europeans to do more in their own defence. The other analysis, which a lot of people do sign up to, is he just doesn't care about Europe, he doesn't care about NATO, he does care about Vladimir Putin, the world's changed. Which do you think is a more accurate assessment?
God, it's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, you talk to people, as I did on Friday evening, socially, who are close to the Trump administration. And look, they'll obviously kind of spin that first interpretation, that this is a sort of, shaking Europe by the scruff of the neck to get them to pay more for their own defense. And, this is all part of Donald Trump's kind of bluster to try and force through what he sees are necessary reforms. But the way he's doing it and the way JD Vance are doing it, it is, as you've indicated, really putting the hackles up of people who have fought and, in some cases, lost loved ones in those conflicts. Let's not forget, Afghanistan was a NATO response to 9/11. That was the world, NATO anyway, coming together to help America to fight back against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And the idea that, you're sort of denigrating your closest allies by describing them as a bunch of, random countries who've not fought a war recently, it will just really, really irritate and offend certainly the Brits who were in Helmand and in Iraq as well, who feel that they paid a lot in terms of blood and treasure to fight, as you put it, America's wars, and how quickly it has been forgotten by the vice president. So he's rowed back from that since then. He's tried to sort of suggest he wasn't talking about France and the UK, but the damage was frankly done the minute he said it.
Matthew, the impression from afar I get is that Trump's supporters, I'm not necessarily talking about his hardcore supporters, but actually the broad mass of his supporters are pretty much still behind him on this. They don't feel uncomfortable with him trashing his allies or any of the rest of it. Is that accurate, do you think, or is there beginning to be sort of a group of people who are on the right but are very disconcerted by the kind of language he's using?
Both. Let's remember, much of the vice president, much of the cabinet, much of the national security team around Donald Trump are actually people who did serve overseas in combat. So it's important to recognize, again, this is a posture. This is not a notion of, you fought our wars and we're abandoning you. This is Donald Trump leading a very populist, anti-establishment notion of what were our leaders doing for a quarter of a century. Again, the notion of an appreciation for coming along for Afghanistan, for Iraq, and you absolutely appreciate the service men and women who gave up, again, blood and treasure. But that doesn't mean you don't absolutely question what the leaders were doing at that time in terms of policy and objectives. So beyond that, we saw what the past 4 years were. And if you look at even the map, forget the map of Europe, look at European leaders, over the past 9 months. How many are still standing? This is a time of great change. And the nuances are important. And it's also very clear to say who is right, who is wrong. And Vladimir Putin is the aggressor. But a notion of, a tolerance, an appetite for war, a perpetual war in Ukraine, a notion of a military victory a la World War II style, or even the sacrifices that required, might not go over well anymore, certainly after the past quarter century. So this is all very unclear. Donald Trump absolutely has a very rough mannerism to him. I think that is his intent. The question is, what are the outcomes? Can there be an enduring peace? Yes, he has leverage over Ukraine. Can he exert some of that same leverage over Russia? These are very tough questions that at least we're seeing him try, as opposed to feeding a war machine.
Dan, Europe's one thing, Ukraine's one thing. Turning on your nearest neighbour, Canada, and insulting it in the way that Donald Trump has, viewed from here, that just seems completely baffling. Canada, that really has stuck with America through thick and thin, including all these wars we've been talking about, that doesn't make any sense, I think, to anyone in Europe, and is potentially quite problematic even for the old alliance with the UK, because, of course, our king is Canada's king, and there's a whole raft of complications associated with that. I mean, what's your sense of how Americans are reacting to that? Do they quite like the fact that he's giving Canada a bashing, or do they feel uncomfortable about it?
Well, it depends which Americans you're talking about. Certainly, I think his MAGA base, his real hardcore supporters, will be lapping up every moment. But there'll be plenty of Americans who'll be deeply uneasy about this. It also doesn't make sense in a lot of ways, because on the one hand, he's sort of saying he wants Greenland to get access to the Arctic and to its minerals and, of strategic importance. Well, Canada's got an enormous, front row seat on the Arctic game of sort of geopolitical chess. And yet here we are with America, doing everything it can to irritate and alienate a former close ally. So it kind of doesn't really make much sense. If anything, you'd think you would want to be holding Canada even closer in an embrace, so that you've got that ability to project power into the Arctic with the Northwest Passage opening up and so on, and all of the mineral wealth up there, rather than alienating the country that has an enormous border along the Arctic Circle. So none of this really makes much sense. I wonder how much of it is really about sort of whipping up nativism back home, and showing that he's being tough on trade and tough on the border, and tough on things like the import of fentanyl. Look, there's no doubt that under President Biden, the border in the south along the Mexico border was a real issue. It was a real political hot potato. The number of illegal crossings went up enormously, and it became politically toxic for Joe Biden. Part of this is Donald Trump trying to kind of correct that. But in typical Donald Trump fashion, he's not only trying to be tough on the border with Mexico, he's also now being tough on the other border where there isn't really a problem.
I wanted to just ask you both about something which I've been pondering the last couple of days, which might seem a bit trivial, but when you think back to certainly most British people or European people's childhoods, American soft power is everywhere. Every American film you watch, every American TV drama, which is, let's be truthful, the majority of viewing for a lot of people over the course of their lifetimes, it all has, or it very often has, one central idea behind it, which is that America might be flawed, America might be problematic, America might have bad people in it, but right generally triumphs. Americans are on the side of good, and in the end, that counts for something. And the reason I was pondering it was I was away for a few weeks, and on the plane home, I sat down and watched the double bill of Top Gun, and very enjoyable it was too. But I thought, 2 weeks later, would I sit down and watch those films? No. If you release those films into a European market now, what would be the reaction? Certainly not the same as the time that they were actually released. And I just wondered if this idea of kind of America just transitioning in the world to the point that people actually fundamentally don't like America and don't believe it is on the side of good anymore, whether there's any consideration about the long-term potential damage that might do to how America is seen in the world. I mean, is there any consideration of that, or is it just too far away, too irrelevant?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with Top Gun. I mean, the first one came out, I think it was 1986, 87, end of the Reagan presidency. So a Republican president, but projecting, America is good is the image, the kind of savior against the Russians and the Cold War. The second one came out during the Biden administration. But again, that same message. Would you make that same film now? under Donald Trump's presidency? It's an interesting question, and whether it would have that same worldwide support in terms of the number of people going to see it. I do wonder. You might be onto something there. But fundamentally, look, we're in a place now where everything is being questioned about America's place in the world, its role in NATO, its role in terms of soft power, USAID being closed, having huge effects around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Alienating its closest neighbors like Canada, like Mexico, bullying its way to getting a better trade deal. So this feels like a very different America from the one that we perhaps have all grown up and admired in some ways through films and through their cultural influence. But I would add to the end of that, all things will pass. This is going to be a 4-year term of Donald Trump. Someone else will come along at the end of it. We'll have the midterms in a couple of years' time when they will refocus. That might change the balance of things as well. So I think it's important not to get too carried away and too doom-laden here. If you are an opponent of Donald Trump, it will come to an end. But certainly this has been an epoch-shaping first 50 days.
We've got a lot of viewer engagement at the moment. People are very, very concerned about a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm going to throw some viewers' questions at you, if you don't mind, and maybe we can alternate answers, but please feel free to pick up if you also want to make a comment. So maybe, Matthew, I can start with you. We've got one Facebook user who simply asks, are we safe?
Well, are we safe? Listen, I can say with good authority that right now there are no plans for the U.S. to attack the UK. Then again, the day is early and it's only Monday. I'm joking, of course. Our alliances are strong. Let's also be clear. Let's also be clear. Things change. Let's also be clear, but some things stay the same. Listen, Vladimir Putin is an evil, maybe even crazy, dictator who's now taken aggression yet again in Ukraine. But if this was a World War II style threat, you would have a World War II style response. I hate to even go into detail of what that means, but there would be, wouldn't take all that long to stop it. Yes, he is, creeping up on his borders, always keeping that and needs to be in check. And if we want to be honest, Donald Trump did that. The last 4 years was not so good for that. We're now entering a different age. And it's important to recognize. I'm not trying to minimize, Vladimir Putin or Russia's threat. Do I ever see him rolling tanks and planes into, London or Paris? No. He's getting old too. And the Russian military is not what it was, putting up an unfortunate fight in Ukraine, but they should have taken over that country. Maybe they could have, whatever. The whole world's about to change very, very quickly, very, very dramatically. And we certainly see different adversaries. These are asymmetric. These are going to be around AI, around energy, around information, around economics. This age is upon us. China is on that horizon. How we respond, together and individually will be key for history's sake. But again, right now, are we safe? The answer is safer than we have been, yet, it's always an uncertain world.
Dan, Gerald asks, could NATO continue to exist and operate without the United States? It would mean dismantling some cooperative policies and procedures and possibly new intelligence sharing by members as a counterpoint to the Five Eyes community. But could it be done?
Well, look, the US has been the backbone of NATO since its inception in the post-war period, 1949, I think. Originally, there were 12 countries. We're now up to 32 in NATO. But, of course, no one would want a world in which the US pulls out of NATO. But Europe and the UK still have enormous strengths without the US. Turkey alone has 350,000 personnel in its armed forces. France has another 200,000, Germany 180,000. So if you round up all the numbers of troops without the US, you're getting close to about 1 million troops in those 31 countries without the US, which would be a match for Russia. I don't think anyone would suggest that we want to take on Russia without the US. One of the things the US does provide is critical technology and intelligence, and of course, the umbrella of a nuclear deterrent as well, which the UK and France also have. But I don't think if the US pull out of NATO, it would mean that Russian tanks are going to roll right the way up to, the kind of face the English Channel. Europe has an enormous amount of military strength and an enormous amount of GDP to spend on defence if it really had to, and could easily, I think, be a strong match for Russia.
Matthew, Phil Newson asks, how come Trump gets away with bullying other countries and peoples like he does? In another job, he'd get in trouble, but he just gets away with it.
Well, in some ways, you're paying the cost to be the boss. Conversely, was the notion like, how come Joe Biden, gets bossed around and dictated and neutered on a world stage, whether it's, domestically on spending or internationally, the world falling apart and wars breaking out everywhere and can't control anything. Donald Trump is what every politician dreams to be: attitude and swagger. And some people love it. It's refreshing. They have been spoon-fed the same thing, for the better part of 30, maybe 40, 50 years. The only thing that changes, is that partisan spoon. And this guy put politics in the vernacular. No one says, what does he really think? They believe he's telling you what he thinks. And there are some people that say this is just so unprofessional, so unbecoming. You should not treat, the public, much less any other country or an ally, this way. So he has changed politics. There is some upside to it. There's also some downside. This is a very controversial figure. And some, for the same reasons that he is loved, are the same reasons that he is hated.
Dan, last question is not really a question, but we've had a lot of comments about how Trump said he'd end the war on day one and how he hasn't. But truthfully, he was never going to end the war in a day. And one has to say that if he did get an enduring peace deal, and that's a pretty big if, that would still be a massive achievement. People might disagree with the way he's gone about it, but if he did it, that would still be a very, very big deal.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, he rode back pretty quickly from the solving it in one day to solving it in 100 days. So we are 50 days away from that deadline. We've got talks happening this week in Saudi Arabia involving the Americans and the Ukrainians. There is momentum towards some sort of possible peace deal resolution, perhaps a ceasefire, but there's an awful lot of detail to sort out. And I suppose his critics will say, yeah, great. You get a peace deal with Russia, but it could be a replay of these failed Minsk agreements that were signed in 2014 and 2015 that then resulted in Vladimir Putin coming back and taking another chunk out of Ukraine. So I think some people will say, yeah, fantastic achievement, but not if it means Russia has time to rearm, regroup, and come back for another go.
We're doing the talking, but we want you to ask the questions. So please do email talkingpolitics@itv.com to make sure we're discussing the issues which matter most to you. Now, it may seem like more or less, depending on your politics, but this is not the 100th day, but the 50th day of the Trump presidency, and it has certainly kept us all on our toes. We'd be here all day if we tried to talk about everything that's happened in that time. So we asked Matthew and Dan to come up with something which has really stood out for them, away from the infamous, obvious things like the Oval Office row. Dan, what sticks out for you? Maybe you go first.
Yeah, I think one of the stories we haven't featured so prominently in our bulletins and maybe in this podcast as well is just the effect on thousands of federal workers who are being laid off. I mean, this is quite a kind of domestic story, I suppose, in the US, but it's getting huge coverage here. Entire agencies being closed. USAID, we've mentioned the international development arm of the US government, but also there's lots of other smaller agencies as well. And I did some coverage of this and have been talking to people who've been affected, either people who've been laid off or people who are worried about being laid off. And one of the things that's struck me was how fearful people are, those who are still in some of these agencies. I spoke to one guy anonymously who asked us to call, to just use his name, Steve, because he's worried about his future. He still works at a federal government agency. And he told me about the kind of, the fear that Big Brother in the form of Elon Musk and Doge are looking over their shoulder, and they're being very careful about how they conduct themselves online. Here's what he told me.
There's fear of more generally an authoritarian government. Some of my colleagues have set up a after-hours Zoom call to discuss things, and we're making sure that no one's using any work facilities because of worry about being monitored. I never thought things would get this far.
That, for me, is pretty astonishing in America in 2025, that a federal worker is so worried about talking openly about whether he's going to get fired or, whether, talking about Elon Musk in a derogatory manner, that they're having to take all of their conversations off their work devices, off their work phones, and sort of conduct these conversations in secret. And this was a man, Steve, whose family had escaped. He's Jewish. His family had escaped the pogroms of Europe and had fled to freedom in America. And suddenly he has this feeling that, we've seen this kind of movie before. He basically said, that, this is how an authoritarian government starts. It's that fear of speaking out, that fear of, not being able to speak freely in your own country, in his case, literally in his own living room for the concern of who's listening in.
Matthew, what would you pick out from these astonishing first 50 days?
Well, I mean, we've had so much, right? Every day is this massive, monumental, historic moment that seemed to be, maybe forgotten by tomorrow because there's another one. Chainsaws, Doge raids, departments, immigration. Where do you want to start? My thing is, my gosh, if you look at the opposition, what are Democrats doing? How are they handling Trump right now? To me, that's really the understory. I live here in Washington, D.C. Listen, when Trump first took office and after his 2016 win, there were massive protests every day. Name an issue, there were resistance stars, Democrats in elected office, outside, waves, this whole notion. Now, Donald Trump is more popular than ever. His win in 2024 not only carried the popular vote in the Electoral College, but every county in America moved right. And where did he build? Not with the elites and those highly educated, white elite. No, it was this minority group: Hispanics, Asian Americans, African, Indian Americans, moving towards him. This notion of the most vulnerable people are actually voting much more right now. So now you have Democrats not knowing how to act, how to react to President Trump. You saw that in the last State of the Union, where people where the Democratic Party is actually being panned for some of their behavior. And then you even had, this notion of Kash Patel, one of Donald Trump's most controversial picks, to head the FBI. The day of that vote, you had all but a group of, a few older, very nice, but, kind of not putting up a fight, U.S. Democratic senators outside the FBI. This was the resistance. Again, you used to have protests, people's, from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol, and then just to go out with just such a whimper. Democrats still do not know what to make of Donald Trump and his cultural, economic, guttural, populist attitude and political posture. So to me, it's really, again, the backlash, the whiplash, all yet to be seen.
Can I just ask you for a final thought, really, about what you think the mood of Team Trump actually is and what the kind of vibe inside the White House? Maybe before we do that, can we just take a clip of Saturday Night Live? Because I'm also interested in the kind of some of the personality battles that are clearly now going on around him, including Elon Musk versus the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Let's just take a clip of that and then we'll talk about it.
I can't have you two at each other's throats, okay? After all, I have a perfect record. Everyone who's ever worked for me has left on good terms and then gone on to write a book called The Man Who Ruined Everything. So you two need to start acting like mature adults, okay? So let's begin with Marco.
Polo.
No, Elon. I'm trying to talk to Marco.
Polo.
I think what Saturday Night Live was sort of alluding to there humorously was this sort of reported rift between Elon Musk and Marco Rubio and some of the other members of the cabinet, and this idea that that perhaps, you know, behind this veneer of, you know, full steam ahead unity, there are divisions. And I certainly picked that up with the source I was speaking to on Friday, that, you know, I think there is a division between the more traditional Republicans, you know, fiscally conservative, who are concerned about the economy, who are concerned about how this tax cut that Donald Trump is promising is going to be paid for, who are concerned about the more bombastic foreign policy statements, and, you know, who are slightly uneasy, and the out-and-out Republican, MAGA supporting Trump cheerleaders who think everything he's done so far has been fantastic. It's time to shake things up domestically and internationally, and he can do no wrong. So I think we will see more of these tensions bubbling up as we move away from this victory, and you'll see more splits within the cabinet, I think, with people concerned. And you touched there, Tom, on the economy as well. I mean, there are some worrying signs of inflation being stubborn, not a lot of growth going on, and stagflation being a term that's being kicked around now, which is this worrying combination of stagnation and inflation that's very difficult for the Fed to deal with. And don't forget that Donald Trump's victory, you know, was heavily predicated on him reducing prices and making the lives of ordinary Americans easier. And I think if we don't see prices come down and things improve and interest rates come down, then that's going to become a much bigger theme and a much bigger problem for Donald Trump going forward.
Fascinating stuff, as always. Can't believe it's only been 50 days. Where will we be after 100? Who on earth knows? But we'll be talking about all that and more in the weeks ahead. That's all we've got time for on this occasion, I'm afraid to say. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matthew. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review if you're enjoying Talking Politics USA, or even possibly if you're not. We've got broad shoulders. You can also watch the podcast on ITVX and indeed on YouTube. I'll be back with the UK edition of Talking Politics on Wednesday. Until then, thank you for watching or listening, whichever you were doing. Goodbye.